Welcome, everybody, to First Principles Podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to all subjects, environmental, cultural, political, all that fun stuff we break down from the ground up. Today's episode is going to be focused on Climate Trace, which is a new initiative from our good friend Al Gore. And you may be familiar with him as the former presidential nominee in the U.S., or maybe for some of his environmental stuff, where he made the movie An Inconvenient Truth, where back in the days it was very impactful when it was first released because of its really extreme claims of the climate disasters that were impending. And of course, very little, if any of them, really came true. And I guess Al Gore, since he's been so successful with his environmental work, he's continuing more with Climate Trace. And let's get more into what Climate Trace is all about. You want to give a quick your thoughts on that real quick, Elliot?
Sure. We have arrived. The technology we've been hoping for centuries, it's here. Big brother in the sky.
Okay, damn.
This is
that's one way of putting it.
This is groundbreaking. What is Climate Trace? Climate Trace is using satellite, so remote sensing on satellites, imagery of different sorts, along with AI, artificial intelligence, deep learning algorithms, and an assortment of databases on the ground level to pinpoint different sources of CO2 across the globe. So it is a way of monitoring CO2 emissions at a finer grain level. And it is a new technology in a sense. It is a program that just came online last year, and its current database takes a look at CO2 emissions over the last 5 years with the actual finer details looking at CO2 in the last year and a half. So that is what Climate Trace is. Climate Trace is a new way of monitoring CO2 emissions.
Yeah, it's truly what they claim is very groundbreaking and revolutionary, right? Because what they say is that before there's been data sets, but they've never really been aggregated, and they're kind of all over the place, and they're missing information. It's very costly in order to get, for example, to a location and measure the emissions from any given spot. And they state how that's one of the challenges that this technology really helps people overcome. So instead of going to each polluter, going to each mine, going to each steel mill, production facility, whatever, and measuring the emissions directly from there, you are able to essentially take these data sets and make essentially best guesses, is how I'll put it, which there's so much to talk about with this, and I have so many thoughts just about their claims about the real-time monitoring. So I just want to clarify the definition that you put out there and state the three principles that they state that Climate Trace is based on.
Sure.
So number one is based off of the geospatial data and satellite data that they have, and more specifically that they publicly source. So they're sourcing this data from public databases. That's one of the brilliance of this whole Climate Trace initiative, as they claim. So they don't actually own any of the satellites from which they get data, but rather they, through what they claim, the advent of more satellites collecting more data in recent years, and more sharing, they, as a result of that are able to take that data and aggregate it. So that's one. They're taking this satellite data. Number two is they're actually taking emissions data from countries that have been reported globally. So they're actually, say, for example, if you're the U.S. EPA, right, and you're in you're in charge of tracking the emissions from auto companies or whatever, you have to make this data public. Same for Environment Climate Change Canada, whatever it may be. And there's huge data sets that exist. So that's the second input. It's taking these two data sets. So again, first you have the satellite data. Number two, you have the emissions data from public. Again, everything is public information, as they claim. Number three, this is where things get interesting, and we have machine learning where they actually take the photographs, take the satellite data, take the emissions data, and they're able to learn and essentially teach the algorithm when certain polluters, certain maybe a factory might be on or off. When, for example, you might be able to see with the satellite imagery that a coal power fire plant is actually operating, or is it off, right? And one of the things actually in their report study actually shows images, and where they say, okay, this is when it's on, this is when it's off. And funny enough, one of the images is totally white and blank when you can't see anything, and yet they claim that it's on. So it seems like it has a tendency for a false positive, which would be just one easy.
Well, cloud cover, right? Because quite
Exactly.
literally they were showing in that figure the visual in visible light, the plume that was coming out of the stacks, right?
Yeah. Exactly. That's the one. So with again that third component of the AI, the machine learning, what their claim is though is that they are not only able to tell you where the emissions are taking place, when the emissions are taking place, but also how much the emissions are taking place. And to me, that last one is the one that I have the biggest beef with, or the biggest issue with. The when we just discovered, or we just discussed really quickly, a quick criticism of, saying when it's emitting is relatively easy, but of course when you have cloud cover and you have visual just illusions that take place naturally when these things are happening, that it's easy to have maybe a false positive or some sort of level of inaccuracy. But again, when it comes to how much, and their claim to be able to tell you how much of the pollution is taking place, that's where I have the most issue with.
Yeah. That third component, the AI and the machine learning, is what makes this revolutionary. And I think what I get the sense is that they're going to use places in the US as way of calibrating their algorithm. So, for example, the US, if you can't get to the China to actually go, what is that power plant emitting, you're going to look at satellite imagery of a plant in the US. You're going to take exact emissions data from the ground, calibrate it with your imagery from your top, and try to develop something that is able to identify that, because it's tricky to do. They're also talking about how methane is easier to identify at a global level compared to CO2 because of the background concentrations. And
that was another point I actually had beef with. Sorry, say that again, because I want to highlight something. So say that again.
Sure.
I want to point out how my criticism of it.
Yeah. So going back
or
to
finish your thought.
All I'm saying is that they're going to try to calibrate their AI using ground data and the satellite image in places they have control over and can get accurate measurements from, right? Other places, that maybe are not playing ball or not willing to give accurate information according to them, those they're going to be guessing at those numbers using the algorithms that they calibrated in places that have played ball with them. But there are obviously issues with still even the AI's ability to detect accurately those numbers. And I think that's where we get into some of the squirreliness of it. But I wanted to say they were talking about in that report the complication that background levels of CO2 have on detecting modern outputs or anthropogenic human-made outputs of CO2.
Yeah.
And how they were claiming it's easier for methane. But I feel like you had something to say on that.
Right. And my main thought on that right away was, if you're struggling with that right now, then like that just makes me question your whole technology, because that should be easy, right? Okay, because what is their claim? This background concentration of 400 ppm makes it tough to detect the concentration of CO2 emissions at these assets, as they call it, as these plant source emissions, right? So my issue with that is that when you look at a plume, right, that's coming out of a stack from some sort of coal power plant, right? The concentration from that plume is going to be way higher than 400 ppm, like background concentration or not. Like that's not going to be hindering your capacity to detect the concentration of that plume. If you're struggling with that, then that's where I'm like, okay, this is
what about
stupid.
all the sources that are of a concentration closer to that 400 and less, but maybe are, on the, like something like some agricultural practices or something like that. That's where it's not, maybe I'm just playing devil's advocate here because I don't know all the details on levels of emission of CO2, but it maybe there could be a large contributor that sits in that about the same concentration as current or less than, that are just hard to pinpoint now because of that. You know what I'm saying?
Such as.
Well, I don't know. That's what I mean. Like I'm guessing the only thing that I can think of that's not as concentrated, potentially not as concentrated, would be some forms of agriculture or just like leaky landfills that are just very low level and maybe highly diluted pretty quickly. They're not meant to be emitting out of a stack or pipe at any level. They're just kind of more just leaky background concentrations.
Well, landfills would be more for methane, right?
That's true.
But so again, I go back to my premise. So 400 ppm. What is the product of any combustion?
CO2 and water.
Okay, CO2 and water. So when it comes to a methane, right, a natural gas power plant, the product of that combustion is going to be CO2 plus H2O. This is just our basic chemistry. So when it comes to the emissions that are coming out of that giant stack that's 100 meters into the air, that giant cloud, we have essentially CO2 mixed with a bunch of other crap, incomplete combustion. It's not 100%, but you have the purest, essentially, concentration of CO2 that could be coming out at a point source. And yet you're telling me the background concentration of 400 ppm is too much for you to be able to detect that? That to me tells me that your technology is not as good as you're telling the public that it is.
Well, and that's just it, right? When I read the report that anybody can find on the Climate Trace website, it is filled with buzzwords, and it's making a pretty big claim in terms of what it's saying it's capable of doing. But maybe we'll get more into the nitty-gritty details. But I will say, consider this as a pitch, right? This is a great time to maybe jump into some clips I got. So there is a 2-3 minute video that has been put together with Al Gore voicing over it discussing what climate trace is. And I want, as we go through this, everybody to listen specifically to the language, the words used, and then these buzzwords in terms of up and coming technology, AI, machine learning, that type of thing. And then also listen to, as we do on the show, the background musical bed. And I mean, it's very telling in itself, but I mean, that is the state of entertainment. So,
Yes.
what
I always have that emotional spike with the music, you know.
yeah, just to remind you that even don't listen to what we're saying so much and think about how that makes you feel. Listen to how the music is making you feel.
It's a subcommunication.
It's a sub-communication, yeah.
There you go. There you go. And one small thing, actually, I don't know if it's a small thing that's worth getting into right now, but just in terms of like a criticism that I have, do you think it's worth saving for afterwards or now that I should say? But it's okay. It's essentially related to the overall premise or the meta narrative that Climate Trace is trying to push is that it's focused on transparency, right? It's focused on holding people accountable, holding the assets, the companies down to the airplane. They claim they're down to the airplane. They're able to track it, and yet they can't. Okay, anyways, I don't not to go back down that rabbit hole, but they're claiming that they can track it down to the airplanes and ships. So with that whole sense of transparency that they're trying to hold the polluters accountable, what I don't appreciate is from the report that they have that when you enter their website and you download it, and then it apparently speaks about their methodology of how they do their thing, it is very untransparent in terms of how they're actually generating the results, and more specifically, what are the errors associated with them, and also what were the calibration results. And all these, like, when you get into obviously the nuances and the nitty gritty of how this modeling game works, that transparency of, you know, what are their assumptions, how do these things work, that isn't there. And to me, that is hypocritical and shows a disingenuous nature when you are claiming to be out there trying to hold people accountable. It's all about transparency, but yet you are not being transparent in the methodologies that you're using to actually generate your results. You just have this black box where you have these inputs, and then boom, we'll tell you this stuff. We're the grand magicians. We have all the answers. Well, how? What are you doing? What's the actual? It's not we're working with experts leading climate science. That's not enough. You actually show your work. Show your fucking work, man. That's the pisses me off. And so that's my little rant on that.
Well, I want to come back to that exact topic, but let's go through some of this promotional video clips here, and then definitely circle back and talk about methodology and uncertainty. Yeah.
All right. So clip 1.
What if I told you that we don't actually know where our greenhouse gas emissions come from? Sounds crazy, right? But we don't really know. Up until today, we've had to rely on vague, high-level estimates that often come from the polluters themselves. And that information is often years out of date and almost always full of gaps and omissions. It's not data you can act on.
Okay, right off the bat, how spooky and weird is that background music?
Legit.
Like,
it's like this is dangerous. This is threatening. This is like
ominous.
It's like meant to, like, wow, isn't this scary? We don't know where the emissions are coming from.
Can you believe that?
It's like actually everybody with like two, like, you know, a functioning prefrontal cortex realized. I don't know. Maybe I'm giving people too much credit, but I don't know.
Well, I almost want to say that, yeah, there's definitely flaws and uncertainty and estimation going on in current inventories. But in some ways, it seems a little untruthful to make the claim that we really don't know. We have a good idea of where we expect them to be, but I understand what he's trying to get at is, for people that don't know, and I certainly didn't know, but the way you measure emissions is not as simple as, say, like measuring water use at your house, where you have a relatively accurate meter that is in real time detecting how much water is flowing through your pipe at any given moment, and that gives you a pretty accurate reading of water usage. For CO2 emissions, I know from working briefly at Environment Canada that, and in their air emissions department, that we keep these inventories of which industries are emitting and how much they're emitting. But a lot of that has to do with reports that come from those companies, those industries, and those are entered in, and there isn't necessarily a stack measuring exact CO2 emissions. It's more done, I wager, from how much of the coal they burn. For example, we know how much CO2 emit. We're not measuring CO2 as if it's water going through a pipe. So yes, we rely heavily on the reporting from industry. Otherwise, we would basically require third-party government agencies to be pretty much at these industries on a day-to-day basis, making measurements and such like that. There are third parties involved in checking and auditing, for sure. For sure they are, in Canada at least. But there's not some government guy with a clipboard that's at these industries marking down on a piece of paper every day, oh, they put this much coal in and this is how much CO2 was emitted, type thing, right?
The data that he's speaking of, though, it's, I think, ironic because he like, you know, in this intro thing, he just kind of says how there's gaps in it and how it's often comes from the polluters themselves, right? But at the same time, we just discussed when we were talking about climate trace and how one of the main inputs into their whole calibration process is actually this very same data, which he criticizes. So
right.
You see the you see the irony.
Well,
so
and that's just sorry to cut you off, but that's just it. I listened to this video before doing any reading up on the topic, and then to find out that the same databases and inventories are still used as a calibration tool. It's like, wait, hold on a second.
You should be like, again, like this whole thing of like transparency of like, and how it's just not really being transparent and honest with that sense of their methodologies, because he's like, oh, it's just so bad that we're doing this, but meanwhile you're using that same data, and then that implies that your calibrations are based off of what you claim to be improper data. So you've already called into question your whole methodology, or like not even the methodology, but the accuracy, which again, I go back to one of my criticisms, is like you have to be talking about what are your confidence level, what are your calibrations, and the accuracies with which you were able to reproduce those emissions, because this is all about, you're putting in this data for future predictions. It's so that you're able to then have a real-time assessment, as they claim. That's why you're trying to fuse these data sets together, so then you can do real-time learning. Okay, so based on this history of emissions, we know that, okay, these guys are operating at this amount, these guys are operating at this amount. So that, but again, like that transparency of that methodology just isn't there.
Yeah. So I don't want to. Yeah, I want to go into more into that area, but let's go jump to the next clip, because I want to, and let's just listen to how that music changes right away. This is so basically what I've done, just to everybody that doesn't know, is I've taken that clip that's on the website there and cut it up into shorter pieces. So this is going to continue right off of what we just heard.
That's why we're building Climate Trace. Our ultimate goal, to create a comprehensive, highly detailed, up-to-date map of exactly where all global emissions are coming from and who is producing them. How does it work? We capture measurements from satellites and thousands of sensors based on land, in the sea, and in the sky. Data that's never been seen before. Climate Trace uses AI to verify the data, identify patterns, and provide new powerful insights. So decision makers will have all the information they need to make informed choices and reduce emissions.
I have a problem with him saying that AI verified it. I feel like the correct thing to say is you verify it by calibrating the AI. AI doesn't. That's a weird one. I just feel you don't say, because that AI is learning from the inputs that you give it and correcting it based off calibration. But it was just interesting there, based off our current discussion, to hear him say verified by AI. But
Exactly, because it's the AI will become the new god. Like they will use AIs to validate any action, because they'll say that the AI is the science. It's really what it comes down to.
yeah,
That's why it's phrased in that way, and that's a good pickup on that. Yeah.
yeah. Oh man, oof. I wasn't gonna go down that road yet, but yeah, let's put a pin in the AI is God.
But yeah, just this whole clip, man, it's so, again, like this whole thing of like, who are you? Are you gonna be like the global police on CO2? Like, who made you? We're gonna give policymakers all the data that they need in order to hold companies accountable. Like, who made you the global CO2 police? Like,
Right.
what are your interests in this? Are you, or you're just some dude that's really passionate about tracking CO2? Like, I don't know. There's just something really fishy over here.
Not only that, is they talk about in the report how Climate Trace is going to be kind of this objective third party. I'm sorry. How can you be objective when you're Vice President Al Gore and you literally were the one to politicize climate change, unlike anybody we've ever seen before?
How much have you profited off of this whole climate change thing? You know, like, and then you're gonna say it's objective? Like, you don't have any bias, really? You're just objective here?
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild.
Yeah, dude,
and you hear in that clip that they're going to use this to inform policy, and this is going to be the way to say, hey, company X or country X, you're doing this. Oh, your per capita releases is this. You need to cut down. This is going to turn into a finger pointing mess at these climate meetings. That's the only sense of the outcome. That is my sense of the outcome of a program like this. But time will tell.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's hard to say how it's not going to be a finger pointing exercise, but at the end of the day, like, it's like they're only going to point the finger at the people that it's convenient to point fingers at, and because the rest of the people are just not going to care. I don't know, because they had things on China and how their emissions in terms of mining, I think, were like 3 times over the global average or something. But like, okay, so what are you gonna do about that? Like, how are you gonna force China to? I don't know.
And why is their mining so high? Is it because they produce a lot of the goods that the rest of the world uses?
Yeah, yeah. And one small thing I actually wanted to point out was like this whole again, going back to their, like, just since we're talking about his whole claim of the scientific accuracy and the validity of their method, and how, just we're gonna better inform decision makers, right? Very very particular language, because he wants to inform people. So let's look at in their report that they actually released, that documents how the kind of the climate trace premise, how it works, gives some examples, and it goes into an example of fires in Russia and the U.S. So it says
forest fires, right?
Yeah, forest fires, right? It says, while initial U.S. fire emissions for 2021 year to date have not yet passed 2020 totals, if fires persist on the country's west coast, emissions may end up higher than 2020. The 2021 year to date total is also a significant increase from totals for the years 2015 to 2019, which ranged from 118 to 280 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So they don't really state what the emissions in 2021 are. But aside from that, that's not really the main issue. The main issue for me is that when you use the term in scientific literature, significant, the term significant, right? When they say like the total is a significant increase from the total of the years 2015, 2019, then you have to typically follow that up with the p-value for the confidence interval.
Yeah.
Right.
Significant is legally a very problematic word in scientific, and people, most scientists and scientific reports avoid using it unless it's backed up by statistical significant value, and they usually have a whole section in the report discussing what they mean by that word.
Right. So it's essentially a cardinal sin in science, let's put it that way, to use the term significant without having that mathematical statistical study to validate your claim. It's a huge no-no. Essentially, you cannot get published if any academic journal worth its merit, worth its salt, won't publish you unless you show your work for how you claim significance, because again, that is as you said, a legal term, a very scientific term. It's a statistical term. So when he's talking about better informing politicians, policymakers, well, let's see how you're better informing them with your terminology that is misused, inappropriate, and dangerous, because the way that I see it is that there's a reason why there is such a importance put on this word, because there's value in this word. So you can't use it just willy-nilly and then say, oh, we're better informing people. Well, you didn't even provide your p-value. What's your damn p-value, bro? You even give me your p-value and they're going to say significant? You're going to talk about better informing policymakers? Get out of here.
Where's your p-value?
What's your p-value?
There's a t-shirt.
That's a t-shirt. Yeah, branded. What's it? I love it. What's your p-value?
Let's finish off this guy's clip. Oh man.
No more relying on self-reporting. No more waiting years to see if reductions are actually happening. And most importantly, no more hiding. We've already created a comprehensive inventory of emissions from every country with detailed emissions data from specific industries. Over time, we'll be able to monitor power plants, feedlots, airports, landfills, anything and everything that is creating the emissions that are driving the climate crisis. It's the ultimate tool to battle emissions, and it's being built by the leading experts in climate science and technology teaming up.
No more hiding.
Yeah.
No more hiding. When he laughed there, I wanted to say this about him laughing there. Okay. So the way I look at this is, he's laughing at the fact that people are hiding the amount of emissions that they're producing. Oh, bad people, terrible, terrible. Oil and gas, bad, bad. You know, this is the problem we're facing right now. We're making it so that hiding, in some senses, is desirable because of the language, the demonization, and the lack of alternatives to industries that are going to suffer the most by perhaps letting people know what they're actually doing, right? Like, why would I lie to you about how much CO2 I'm emitting if I felt like something productive was going to come out of that? But if his whole kind of view on this is definitely one that I think comes from kind of like a kind of bitter and distrust of an industry that has lied in the past. But I want to go like, why is it that case? And you can definitely look at the current climate, political climate, cultural climate, not environmental climate, and go, well, there's certain reasons why people might be a bit more sensitive about talking about how much they're emitting.
It's very antagonistic.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like painting, like when you speak with that idea in mind, like, oh, no more hiding, it kind of frames it in that light where we know these guys have been hiding their emissions for some sort of period of time. But meanwhile, he himself claims that the emissions from these companies are self-reported. So it's kind of like I'm not trying to stand up for freaking fossil fuel companies, but it's kind of like a slanderous term because like literally these companies have to self-report, as he himself said, and then he's saying, oh, but they're underreporting. They're actually hiding stuff, right? Well, can you, I don't know, show some cases of that happening? And maybe there are some where, and that's been found. I mean, of course, Volkswagen, that was a great example with their emissions hiding because of they were all altering. It had a system where it could detect when it was being put into a test to verify its emissions. So then it would tweak it, and then it would show up as being lower than it actually was, right? So it's not to say that these types of hiding of data, it doesn't happen from company, but it's just when it comes to reporting and this kind of stuff, I guess it's a promotional video, so he's got to make it quick and snappy and that kind of stuff, but it's just again, like not really truthful. If you're gonna like make claims like that, like, oh, they're hiding data, like, well, what can you give some like specific examples? And again, not to say that there aren't any, but just in this context, because there's so much information that's collected. There are so many industries, and it is so heavily regulated. And even though he says that they can underreport. Well, in fact, there's often a lot of meta studies that take place. And I can tell you from my experience where you actually have tracking and you're over multiple years, right? So you have a series of data from industry that spans many years, right? And you're actually analyzing based on average, median trends, how all these companies compare, relatively speaking. So the government
to one another?
To one another, exactly. So the government definitely has their eyes on any types of outliers, and of course, it's not perfect, right? It's still, things can still slip through the cracks, but it is to say that these types of analyses are being done to track where potential underreporting might be happening. Where it's like, oh, okay, if you're a company of this magnitude, for example, and then we see an equivalent company and they're emitting double, or they're reporting double the emissions, then that might be a bit of a red flag. Like, okay, let's follow up, see what's up. You guys are the same size as these guys here, but meanwhile you're emitting, or you're reporting half as much as emissions. So these types of studies do occur, and it's again disingenuous to say that, oh, all this underreporting, or they're hiding this stuff. And well, I would just like to get some evidence behind those claims.
Yeah, and I can't think of, or I don't know of any specific examples, but I don't doubt that some exist. So putting that just aside, I also feel like the whole cap and trade system, which is in place in Canada, a framework of it is in place, has pushed emission industries to try to accurately record their outputs, because under that model there's a certain threshold you can emit up to, and if you are under it, you can use that the difference between what you are allowed to emit and what you actually emit, if it's lower, to move those, trade that as a credit, right? So the idea that there's a gross systemic failure to report or lying about reporting, you got to kind of question that. I know not all countries are doing a cap and trade, and maybe it's more prevalent, the poor records in these countries, but I imagine just that most places that use a cap and trade system are doing an all right job. Would you think that's a fair assessment?
An all right job of what?
All right job of accurately tracking their emissions, because they're under a system where they have to prove that they actually released less than their allowed amount to collect on those credits.
What you're saying is they're operating in good faith.
Right. Yeah.
We should theoretically be trustful of the data that they're reporting, because, or is that what you're saying? So,
and especially in places that have a cap and trade system. It's not a system that's employed in all over the world, but places that do have it likely are more well, you want to say they're acting in good faith, but they also have an incentive to accurately report it, especially if they're trying to show a difference, like they have lower emissions than what they're allowed to emit, because that
right.
credit,
But if you're a bad emitter, then you might want to underreport something.
Right,
so
you're
you don't get
disincentivized to do it.
dinged for-
100%.
right.
100%.
So I would say that, like, thinking about the data, one thing for me that's interesting is that his whole claim that they will be able to accurately measure, again, I go back to this idea, accurately measure data with their satellites, with their models, with their artificial intelligence, right? With real-time measuring. And he purports that this is more accurate than the emissions data that's being reported by the companies. And he kind of glances past that. To me, that's that's a strong claim, because what you're saying is that your satellite data combined with your AI, which you have in machine learning, which is, again, this black box, that is more accurate than the actual data being reported from the companies themselves. And I say that the only way that can be true is if, again, you push this idea that the companies are acting in bad faith, that they're underreporting. Because when you actually look at this claim that his satellite machine artificial intelligence predictions are more accurate than the reported data, to me, that is absolutely 100% impossible. Because if you're a natural gas power plant, if you're a coal-based power plant, as we discussed, you're not directly necessarily measuring the flow of water, right, as you would through a pipe, but you have we have essentially physics and chemistry on our side. We have the beauty of the conservation of mass and the principles of mathematics that govern that. So we know that if we're burning X amount of methane, if we're burning X amount of coal, with the conservation of mass, that will generate X amount of product, right? We have stoichiometry, we have our chemistry, we know that X amount of methane will generate X amount of CO2. So I say that is way more accurate because the companies know how much they're burning. They know how much they're operating. They have the numbers. They're the ones that are doing it. So for you to state that your satellite, I gotta go back, your satellite freaking AI bullshit is more accurate than the actual data from the companies, it can only be true if, again, your whole perspective is again in this antagonistic, in this distrusting, adversarial way look at industry, that they're just total liars, everything is false that they're reporting, which may be true, but I would like to see some data. I would like to see some data to demonstrate that is the claim, because again, like, the data that they have for the emissions are going to be 1,000 times more accurate than your freaking predicted models.
Yes, I want to talk about. Well, you brought up lots of points there.
Yeah, I went on a rant. Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, so much to say about this subject.
Yeah. There's a lot to say about this subject, and so I'm going to jump into something I wanted to talk about, which is this whole concept of remote sensing. Remote sensing has entered into the engineering field over the last couple of years, and I have seen it personally in my industry, which is environmental remediation and environmental assessment of contamination, show up to replace things like doing a ground survey. So instead of you having to have a guy walk across the entire landfill to take elevation points, you send a drone over and you collect all this elevation data remotely. Another example, you're trying to determine how surface water flows over an area, a large site, a large property. You can use, again, a drone to fly over with sensors on it, and it takes these measurements and it says, okay, based on these measurements, we put that data into the software. It says, this is our catchment area. We suspect all water that lands on this section of our site will drain to this point, and all the water that goes on this section of the point will drain to this point. However, these are all just estimates, because after you do that, you do something called ground truthing. And this is where you actually walk the areas that these drones and these algorithms are saying are the ways the water go. And you look and say, is water actually flowing here? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes a tree cover and obstructions on the ground make the sensors go a little wacky and they think something's higher or lower than it really is. Sometimes a stream has an artificial block in it, a beaver dam. Humans have literally infilled a stream or something like that, and there's no culvert through it. So something you thought was flowing this way and going into this lake actually doesn't do that. So, and these are like the little details that you have to pick up after you've done this larger global analysis with the remote sensors. And don't get me wrong, these remote sensors, because of what they are able to do with limited human effort, is incredible, right? Like, it's to do something like that would take so many hours of someone taking shots and working that out by hand. It would take so much time. It's so unaffordable. But now with sensors on drones, this type of stuff is taking over in engineering. So
a question to you on that.
Yeah.
When you have the initial scans that the drones do, and then when you have to do the ground truthing, the follow-up, what degree of inaccuracy do you notice? If you can sum it up in some sort of number, for example, based off of the theoretical map that the software gives versus the ground truthing, like, is it 50% accurate, 80% accurate? Is there a number you could put onto it, or
from what I have seen, and I have limited examples to point to, but from what I have seen, accuracy is pretty good. I would say it's upward of 90% for the general determination of something like elevation. Elevation is something, and here's the thing. because it can't. This is kind of like apples and oranges. What we're about to compare here. Climate trace is its own thing. We're talking satellites in space measuring
Right.
gases. We're talking a drone sitting, 200, 400 feet above the ground surface.
It's a lot easier.
It's a lot easier to get right.
You're just digging a signal and then just seeing how quickly it takes to come back to it, and based on that, pretty much mapping out the elevation.
And
so
so
it's a lot easier to do.
It's a
than
lot
just
easier.
climate
It's
tracing.
going to be,
but it's an example of how the technology is becoming more and more used in industry.
not only that is how how you use that data determines how accurate it can be. So it's like, yes, great, the drone accurately depicted where surface water is going to go, but if the goal is to determine is the contaminant in surface water making it into the lake via a channel, that drone actually was very bad at determining that, because it didn't see the blockage in the creek that literally meant that contaminant in the groundwater never flows directly into the lake. It thought it did because it wasn't able to see at a very small scale the mist dam. And so maybe the contaminant is still getting in the lake, but it has to get into the lake through groundwater flow, which has got its own other set of things to consider. So you got to be careful. It's like, yes, it was good at depicting elevation data, but if you're trying to use that to determine something else, you got to be a little careful, because there's in the what do they call it, granularity. So everything starts, you got a high grains, you have high resolution. That means like you're looking at things very detailed, right? But it's what's missed in between those grains that can be the difference of direct flow of a contaminant into a lake versus it entering through groundwater, which is a pretty big difference. Yeah,
I think those are the things with these technologies like that we need to just be transparent about, and well, companies like Climate Trace anyways need to be transparent about, and not try to frame it as this end all be all solution, like how he says, like, oh, we have the one tool, like this is all you need, we have the magical tool, and he uses all the buzzwords. Oh, we have the leading climate scientists that are working on the climate crisis. So he's using all the right terms, all the right words, but you know what he's not doing? He's not talking about all this stuff, all the potential inaccuracies of using these types of technologies, because it's a solution that shouldn't be questions at all, because it's doing all the buzzwords, it's targeting climate crisis, which is really important. It has climate scientists, whatever that is, and they're really important, and you shouldn't question whatever they tell you, because this is all for the global good, and how dare you question any of it? And we're not going to tell you any of our assumptions, for example, how things are going, how the data has come together, how things were calibrated, how things compare to the actual data, what is the error, the margin of error associated with it. Just so many questions that arise from this stuff,
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes out of the fact that this climate trace program is a coalition, I think is what they call it, a global coalition. So it's a group of independent companies that are using different methodologies to collect the data. But I'm sure, or I would hope that if we went to each of those coalitions and we kept digging into their technical papers, we would get more into the weeds of these uncertainties, and they actually are reporting that. But that aside,
are you sure?
I would hope.
Yeah.
Okay, I would hope. But
Yeah.
so just listen. Listen, what I'm trying to say here is, if you think of the website Climate Trace as being kind of the head of it, and it's got all these little independent guys feeding in information, you would hope as you get down into the weeds of the companies that are actually doing it, you find these numbers. However, me saying that does not negate the fact that Climate Trace needs to be more transparent overall, putting uncertainties on, because here's how this exactly works, and we know this from our engineering schooling background is you've got 4 numbers and you're about to multiply them. And 3 of those numbers are really accurate. They've got decimal points maybe down into the thousands, But then there's one that's, it maybe is a couple hundreds. You've got very poor accuracy. That completely destroys the outcome if you're multiplying those factors together, the certainty of that final number, right? And that creates the error bar. And if you go onto their website and you look at the numbers the dashboard is outputting, one way to consider it is the significant figures that they're showing. So if they're just showing in millions of tons, like 1.3 millions of tons, you can assume there are probably error bars plus or minus a million. That's what they should be doing. If they start showing things down to the hundreds of ton or something, then either they are certain that they're down to that level of plus or minus 100, or they are grossly misleading in their claims. And that is the type of uncertainty and error bars that should be presented, but I'm not seeing being presented. And that's worrisome, right?
Yeah, it's very worrisome because, again, I it's just like the whole premise is based off of machine learning. Like I'll go back to this. Like it's all you claiming transparency, but yet, what does machine learning imply? It implies that there's a progression of learning, that you're going to go from low level of intelligence to a high level of intelligence. You're learning from low to high, right? So that implies that your initial predictions, your initial estimates aren't going to be accurate. And over time, they're going to get better. Well, if that's the case, then you should be able to demonstrate that. You should be able to track and show, look, we're using machine learning and it's improving. It started out because machine learning is an iterative process, right?
Yep.
And when you have anything that's iterative, it's all based off of running some sort of a loop many, many times until you get to an optimized point of solution. And when you have a situation like this, what is the optimum that you're searching for? What is the optimum solution? And these climate trace things that are trying to find that optimum, that are trying to point to that optimum solution, it implies that it takes time. It's a loop. It's iterations, 1, 2, 3, 4. You got to do it. So you should be able to demonstrate that, right? You should be able to demonstrate how your machine is learning, how it's taking in the data, and it's able to process it at a better rate. And at first, look, our level of accuracy was this much, but then look, over time, it's learning. It's actually improving. It's getting better. Like, oh, isn't that great? That would be exciting, and like it would totally feed. And if you had something like that and you were able to be transparent and truly with demonstrating how you're actually putting this data together, then I would be all on board. But so far, not saying that.
Yeah, I want to read, I think this is the last paragraph in the executive summary, and it says, as a continual let me start this again. As a continually improving project developed by a global coalition, Climate Trace welcomes feedback from experts and peer reviewers. In addition, we also invite new collaborators who have domain experience, access to high-quality ground truth data. Here they're talking about ground truthing that could be used to train the algorithms, or have experience in sectors not yet covered by Climate Trace. So they're actually pitching in their executive summary to that they need to get more experts, more peer-reviewed, more high quality ground truth data in it. So, and this comes around. Let's try for a moment to play devil's advocate and talk about the positives of a program like this. I'll give a shot at it first.
Please.
Okay, so CO2 is an emission, greenhouse gas that is causing global warming. Global warming, climate is resulting in climate change, and there are negative impacts of climate change that are going to affect humans and other ecological receptors on this planet. Disruption. So the idea is, if we could understand where humans, or just in general, where CO2 is coming from, we can do a better job at managing those CO2 emissions and actually meeting targets that we place at these global meetings for trying to meet goals to prevent a 1.5 degree warming of the planet. And the current system is it's got bad data, and we talk about on this podcast models that get bad data produce bad data or produce bad results. So garbage in, garbage out. So the kind of the move right now is we collect a bunch of data. We're in a data-driven world. There's so much data that we no longer can rely on human brains to analyze it all. They can't do it fast enough, and they can't really see sometimes the bigger picture. We train AI, computer algorithms, to do this for us. It produces recommendations, it produces conclusions, and what we're trying to do ultimately is manage the situation when it comes to human impacts on this planet through managing CO2 outputs to mitigate the more disastrous outcomes of climate change that will impact humans and ecological receptors. That is, I think, the pitch that they're trying to make here. Do you think?
Okay. I guess I would say the question is, you can agree with all that stuff, and it can be coming from a good-hearted place, and it could be well-intentioned, that kind of stuff. But then my question would be then, okay, let's say, yes, we're all on the same page, and we agree on all that you just said. However, what is the methodology by which we're going to get the results, I guess, that we're looking for? So to me, it's like, okay, yeah, we agree. We need to track more. We need to understand the CO2 emissions better. We need to, and then through that better understanding, right, more data, then we'll have a better sense of where emissions are taking place, and maybe, okay, these are areas that we could focus on to reduce emissions, whatever. But I go back to this premise that I want to say of how it's really fundamentally flawed, I think, with this whole approach, because we're creating more and more data. Again, I go back to methodology, how we're going to do it, and how he purports is climate trace will be a tool for policymakers. So again, when I go back to how we're on the same page, but how are we going to apply this? Okay, what we're going to do is give climate trace this tool to policymakers to then make a decision. So, but when we think about it, what we're doing is taking an exponential amount of data that you just collected, and you just admitted how there's so much data that you need to have machine learning and AI and this and that in order to create these complex prediction methodologies, these tools that you would then put into the hands of people. That
is the problem. So if I had two issues with this, is one is accuracy. Can it be as accurate as they claim it can be? Because if it's not, then we're stuck right back to bad data in, poor bad data out type. The second is, how is it actually going to be used? How is it going to be actually administered in real time? When we talk about managing CO2s, and we haven't gotten into this, but how is that going to look in the real world? Because and what is the objectivity? If we're talking about the groups that are behind this, we are talking about a group of people that think a certain way and are okay with using words like climate catastrophe. They're okay with demonizing industry. They're okay with these type of things. So you would, to me, I think I get a little scared about what kind of data they're using to. Well, not just a bit. It becomes very concerning to me. And so the thing that I worry about, especially when I read in the executive summary, the discussion around the results from the last 2 years showing how much CO2 has dropped off because of COVID lockdowns. So there is going around the internet this idea that there might come a time where climate lockdowns are a thing, and you can laugh all you want at that, but when you have a report talking about how much a power section's emissions dropped in 2020, 2021 due to lockdowns, if the threat becomes high enough, if the climate threat becomes high enough, or the belief that it becomes high enough in our culture, the reality is this is already presenting this is how we would do it. This is how we would curb it. We just lock down for a couple weeks and would meet our targets type thing. And I will read you a section from the executive summary. Typical national emissions inventories are aggregated annual emission numbers. For many sectors, Climate Trace will be able to document data on a finer timescale, such as monthly or weekly emissions fluctuations from certain sectors and individual assets. So sectors and individual assets. We'll come back to both of those. For example, data from Climate Trace member Watts and Times and Transition Zero for the 3 coal-fired plants in India show changes in emissions that resulted from the impacts of major national events, such as India's COVID-related lockdowns and civil protests that disrupted power plant operations. Second example, looking back at 2020, granular time series data from Climate Trace members Ocean Mind confirmed a sudden sharp decline in maritime-related emissions as pandemic lockdowns and travel restrictions brought a temporary halt to the cruise ship industry. So right there, they're talking about how lockdowns have impacted it and how certain assets like cruise ships affect it. So in a time where currently the current situation with Russia and Ukraine and Russian oligarchs and sanctions, there are people talking about seizing assets, ships, the level to which a program like this could be used now to dictate, okay, it's okay for these guys to travel or that ship to go because it's serving a bunch of people, but if it's one guy in a big ship and he's emitting this much, what are we going to do with that? How are they going to manage the criteria to which they use the technology? And that comes down to all technology. It's like technology is inherently not good or evil. It's really in the hands of the people that manage it.
Bro, I just realized it. I just realized how they're going to do it.
Enlighten me.
Oh my God. So remember during the carbon tax episode when we were talking about Elon Musk and how he was saying how, what's going to happen with the carbon tax is naturally the companies are just going to end up charging higher price of gasoline or a higher charge of electricity. So it's going to go down to the consumer, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So keep that in mind. So with this whole climate trace thing, right? Remember how I said with their assets, they claim that they're going to be able to track how much airplanes and ships are emitting. And okay, so we know airplanes, they'll be emitting this much CO2, right? Okay, bringing back the idea of the consumer, how things will trickle down to the consumer. As with the carbon tax, the price trickling down to the consumer at the pump and at electricity. When we're tracking the CO2 up to the degree of specificity that they claim of an airplane or a boat, then thinking of monitoring it and regulating it from the down to the consumer level, they're going to be able to essentially dictate to people Oh, you know what? That trip to Australia. You wanted to take a little trip there. Well, that's gonna be surpassing your CO2 credits. So you know what? We can't allow you to purchase that ticket, because again, it's gonna trickle down to the consumer. Everything comes down to manipulating and managing consumer behavior. So that's my theory of how that this is gonna trickle down to the everyday person.
At the top of this episode, I made the offhand joke about this being Big Brother in the sky. And what I meant by that was Big Brother is not just in Orwell's 1984 is an idea for always being watched, but it's an idea of control and control at a higher level from a government agency. And it's what you're outlining there is something not too far off from like a social credit system where there are certain social metrics by which you are allowed to do certain things in your life, and you have if you surpass it, if we make carbon emissions the something that is of that level, this is going to limit what you can do, basically, because you're gonna and how are they going to know, or how are they going to have the technology to say you've met these things? It's through programs like this.
The AI God.
The AI God.
Bro, this is terrifying. I don't know, man. Like, this is the more I think about it, yeah. Because again, I go back to, okay, I might agree with some of his premises. Okay, we need better tracking, we need better this, better that, more information. But then again, it goes back to, okay, you're taking all that and then putting all this data, all these complex tools in the hands of policymakers, and you're centralizing that decision-making power into the hands of a select few. And that's where I go back to how this methodology is fundamentally flawed, because although you're claiming that you're using such sophisticated methods to track and this and that, you're fundamentally funneling all that down to the bottleneck of a policymaker. What they're supposed to take all these tools and analyze them, and then based on like based on that, they're supposed to make some sort of relevant policy. It goes back to the idea of the beauty of the market, in that it's the markets are decentralized in their decision making power, right? They don't, which is good in the sense that it's not one person that has to analyze all the data, which is fundamentally what Al Gore is proposing. And how that's flawed is that one person analyzing an infinite amount of data is impossible. But when you distribute that analysis where you have a marketplace, so everybody, and oftentimes market is like a dirty word, but market just refers to everybody, me, you, everyone. When the market is the one that's responsible for taking in this complex information, well, now you've disseminated the computational power necessary to understand this complex info, analyze it, understand it, and then make some sort of rational, calculated reaction from it. That's why the markets are, in my opinion, one of the greatest inventions of humankind, and because of that capacity to take large sets of information and not have just one freaking policymaker, one person, and doesn't matter how smart you are, you're going to be limited in how you're able to process a certain amount of data, and you're disseminating that processing again, right? It's the old adage of two heads are better than one. Well, now you have a million heads, and they're all taking in the complex data, the information that's being fed into it, and responding in a rational manner. And that's why I go back to this whole thing of like this climate trace, all these great tools, but putting it down into just the hands of policymakers. No. That's very flawed.
Yeah. Okay, so I think it was Jack Dorsey and Elon were on Twitter going back and forth talking about how they should change algorithms on tech platforms. And Jack Dorsey was I might be wrong on this, but he was saying there should be a selection of the type of algorithms you want to apply to your experience online. And Elon was saying we should have open source algorithms so you can see exactly what's going on. I think, the Climate Trace has the potential to be this evil thing. Let's just call it that. If used wrong, if it starts to control everyday person's life, right? But I don't think it has to be that, right? Like if you could truly do what they want to do and say it's open and transparent, you get down into the methodology and you open all the algorithms up and you actually have that available to everybody, so everybody can kind of honestly use this tool, maybe like Google Earth in a sense. Like everybody gets to see what it's doing, everybody gets to see what it does, and it's not being used to propagate or to enforce some sort of rationale for climate lockdowns or the shutting down of assets or the everyday movement of a person, because we don't even need to get into this, but like how ridiculous it is to control the use of some person who just was born onto this earth and has had no influence over the world and the state of affairs, and now their life is being controlled because of this policy. Those are dark kind of dystopian futures. But in another sense, in this open source, in just purely collecting data, being transparent about how it's being used, understanding what these algorithms are doing and the AI is trying to do, I mean, that is a powerful tool that could be used for good.
It can be used for good, again, depending on how it's used.
Right.
I think that's the key with tools, is that tools are just tools, and how they're used can sometimes, a hammer can be used to build, but a hammer can also be used to destroy. So yeah, again, that's where I go back to my premise that I may agree with a lot of what's being stated, a lot of what's maybe what they're doing, but I go back to if it's being all filtered down into a bottleneck of, okay, we're going to put this tool into the hands of policymakers and then they're going to make great decisions as a result, history would say otherwise.
Yeah.
So there's one more clip here, I think.
Let's play that clip, and then I want to talk about who's funding this.
With Climate Trace, we're making the invisible visible. Join us, join us, join us, join us, join us.
Join me, and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son.
Oh, that was that I clipped that one wrong. That was odd. That was something must have messed up at the end of that.
You must have got the uncut version.
Yeah,
you must have got the editor's uncut version. Dude.
Yeah, if you, all I did was slow down the end and reverse the audio, and then and that's what came out.
What the suspect.
Oh,
join
man.
me. Yeah, it has the bit of that vibe. I'm not gonna lie.
It does. Okay, so who's funding this? This is directly from the website, and it's under their vision. So, the journey began in 2019 when two of our founding coalition members received a Google.org grant. Okay, so Google.org is the charity end of Google, to use satellites to monitor emissions from power plants from space using satellites. The project opened conversations with many researchers and advocates around the world who started asking, could we monitor nearly all human-caused greenhouse gases emissions globally? Our answer is yes. And so this Climate Trace Coalition launched in July 2020 and now counts 11 nonprofits, tech companies, universities, and former Vice President Al Gore as a member. With our first data release in September 2021, we are providing the first comprehensive accounting of greenhouse emissions based primarily on direct, independent observation. Together, we're making greenhouse gas emissions visible by tracing the root of the climate crisis. We're working to help solve it. So that's right on their vision, on their website when they discuss their vision. But I think there are multiple funders of this project. I don't fully know the other ones, but I believe Google was one of the biggest ones.
So again, kind of lacking transparency, I would say. I didn't really get much info there.
Yeah,
Or who specifically? Like that was just very broad.
In terms of transparency, I'm not sure how this works. If they're obligated to show how much each is putting towards the project, but I know that there is on their website a whole list of people funding it, the organizations. I haven't. I didn't bother copying them for this.
Okay. Maybe unfair statement, but
yeah,
you should look into that. The funding.
Yeah. Okay, so the last few clips that I took was just a CBS report talking about climate trace, and I think what you're going to hear is a lot of what we already discussed, but it's basically a CBS reporter came out to Al Gore's estate there. Al Gore was taking him around, telling him how he was taking soil samples to measure soil quality and such.
Of course,
it was funny because
you try any harder.
You know what?
Bro, I know you ain't taking no soil samples. Like, get out of here.
So
look at me on my farm taking my soil samples.
And he even admits as he's driving, he's like, "This is not something I normally do." He's totally doing this for the interview. But yeah. Anyways,
okay, good for him at least.
Yeah, keep that in mind when you listen to this, though.
It's amazing how precise this is to get.
Gore is a major investor in a new tech platform called Climate Trace. It uses satellites, sensors, and artificial intelligence to track greenhouse gas emissions around the globe. Gore believes this will be an important tool to hold countries accountable for their pollution.
We're not the climate cops. We're maybe the neighborhood watch.
Okay. Not the cops. More the neighborhood watch. I think you even brought this up earlier. Of course they joke about it, but it's so obvious to most people that this is what it's likely to become, especially coming out of the U.S. I mean that in the sense that the U.S. is definitely a country known to stick their nose in other people's business and be.
It's a land of regulations.
Yeah.
Much of the West, but yeah, they love regulations.
They love regulations. And I wanted to really point out how that clip began. And it was the interviewer looking down at the computer, and he said, "It's amazing how precise this is." And then it cuts to him explaining it. It was just like
smooth.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
It was like,
with your professional eye there, Mr. Interviewer man. Oh, how precise this is. Yeah, you had your little analysis that you were able to validate that through your years of experience.
Yeah.
in computational machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
Just like get out of here.
Yeah. So, I mean, all that I'm just doing with these clips is letting us digest the way it's being discussed and the way the founding member Al Gore is talking about it, because I think that speaks volumes to how much we should worry about what is to come from this, right? If it were another person pushing this, and if this person was getting in front of all the criticism that is going to come down the line of a program like this, people might feel more open to this technology being out there. But I just think the way that Al Gore is presenting it, the way he laughs at certain parts of it, I just don't. I don't get an easy feeling about,
Yeah.
about this. You know what I mean?
Like he's already anticipating that there's gonna be people saying like, "What are you trying to do here?" Like, "Oh, we're not the climate cops." Like because he knows like that's gonna be the knee-jerk reaction from people. So I guess he's getting ahead of the critics, which is wise. But yeah, it's just and just the fact that he's a huge investor. Are they for profit or are they? Do you know about that? Is Climate Trade?
I don't know. I know
remember
there's
reading about it.
nonprofits involved with it, but if Climate Trace is nonprofit itself, I have no idea.
Yeah, I'd be curious, like how again, guys, going back to that funding question of how that works. Because if Gore is a big investor in it, then is it? But is he running it as a for-profit company or is it a?
I can't imagine
a charity. Is it basically like a charity? So I'd just be curious to get those. They could do probably like a whole episode on that, if anything.
Yeah, going into the finance side of things.
Yeah, but I think it is valuable to see how it's being received in media, and you can, I guess, see how this guy is maybe very the interviewer that is, he's very receptive and kind of not too challenging.
And that's my problem with a lot of
lubing up his hands for
interviewers
Al Gore.
these days. It's like your job is to ask questions, but all I feel like a lot of interviewers are doing is the bare minimum, which is they come up with a couple interesting questions, and I know for politicians those questions get vetted and cut and axed and whatever, but it's like he's not a politician anymore. I'm sure this guy could have asked them some hardball questions, but it's just like they'll come in, they'll ask their already established questions, they'll listen to the response, and they won't follow up or ask any like more questions about it. They just go to the next question. It's like
it's not in the script. It's not in the script, bro. That's why.
Yeah.
They're not gonna ask no follow-up question. What you mean, thinking? What, actually listening to what they're saying and then like having some sort of original thought and then actually communicating that?
God forbid, right?
Yeah.
Like you would have to come up with an ad-lib response to a question you didn't expect. Like,
yeah, it's like, oh, this is so amazing. You're so smart. You're so wonderful. Tell me more. Like, you're such a good person. Like, can you legit like get the bedside lotion ready?
Exactly. Lie back. Yeah.
Okay, let's jump into the second clip.
Yeah.
But our neighborhood is the whole world. We're in constant communication with the scientific community.
Al Gore has been sounding the climate alarm for more than 4 decades. First as a young congressman,
The Arctic is experiencing faster melting.
and then 15 years ago with his planetary PowerPoint in the film An Inconvenient Truth.
The crisis is still getting worse faster than we're deploying the solutions. There is a remaining question about whether we will solve it in time.
He's still optimistic mainly because of young people all over the world now demanding change.
We'll solve it in time.
And this
The
is
mark of any good salesman is put a
pressure.
time. No. Yeah. Yes. Put a time. The time element at the end of your
urgency.
exactly, the urgency. That there's
Yeah.
a time.
It's a
limit.
limited offer.
It's exactly.
Get it while it's here.
Exactly.
Man,
exactly.
like it, and it doesn't take much to identify these things, and then they transition into the whole activism part of it, and I cut it right here because I wanted to ask you, what do you think? What do you think Al Gore thinks of activism and kids? Do you think he's pro it, against it? What is his? What is his?
Is that a serious question?
Wait, you think it's?
You take a wild shot in the dark.
Yeah. Tell me.
He's probably for more activist youth.
Well, let's play that clip and see what he says. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's see it.
I want them to, in the words of Spinal Tap, I want them to turn it up to an 11.
Feet to the fire.
Absolutely. And the more they can march, the more noise they can make, the more demands they insist upon, the faster progress we'll make. I'm a firm believer in that.
And he still believes the climate crisis we created is one we can also solve.
The direction of travel is clear, and I do believe that we will get there.
Oh, he loves those activists because they're going to drive progress, as in the progress of the return on his investment into this technology, because every single one of those children that's a fucking activist for his cause is increased dollars for him to make back for free, because they're literally free advocates for why his technology is so great. So yeah, he's gonna love the shit out of all those young activists because they're gonna drive those politicians right into his hands.
Yeah, man. I honestly, and maybe it is something we should get into at another time, the whole finance of it. But even if it's nonprofit, there's obviously people getting paychecks to work on these, right? Yeah, I'm sure he loves having the misinformed, over-socialized youth,
Anxious,
ready to
neurotic, riddled with fear,
climate.
of a catastrophe impending, on the streets, yelling in favor of his tools. He would love that, I'm sure.
Because, he says, in his own word, it is a catastrophe, and he's not sure, but it could be a catastrophe very, 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 very soon. Very soon. We need to act now.
Yeah. I'm not sure if we'll solve it in time, but there's a limited time offer.
But I do believe we can still solve it.
Yeah, exactly, man. And it's so, I don't know, Al Gore. It's interesting, yeah. When you again go back to like the CBS thing and how he's being received and how it goes through his history of like, oh, he has 40 years of talking about the climate change and this and that, and then it doesn't talk about how there's so many of his predictions that were inaccurate or wrong, first and foremost. And then not only that, but it doesn't really talk about how his influence and his just like being so in the middle of it all, like how that is shaping his mind in the sense that like he's just so like hook, line, and sinker on this path that like there's very and maybe you need that to be a determined person that's going to build some sort of organization that's going to have an impact if you truly believe in your cause. But it can definitely lead to I guess blinders and blind spots, and because you're so set in your way. But again, when you look at his history, when you look at the predictions from the 80s, 90s, Inconvenient Truth, and all the things that he said that were going to happen that they didn't happen, and yet he's still taken so seriously, and then he's saying these things like, oh, things are only going faster, things are only increasing, and yet when we see historically how wrong he's been, like why are we still taking this guy so seriously? Like, how does he still have like a place at the table? Like it's just doesn't make sense unless again you go back to that funding, which that might be a part 2 on this, to really start to track the money, man, because that
tells a whole different story.
Exactly.
Yeah, he is. He's an interesting character, and your point about how come we still take him seriously is, I mean, man, I don't know. Certainly with his track record, and certainly his track record as a political figure, not even as a scientist or an engineer, but as somebody who has worked in the political space, understands marketing, understands all the things, when he gets up and he says things a certain way, don't be naive. He knows what he's doing when he says things like this, right? And these guys, this is kind of an eye opener. I think some people need to realize is that these political figures, which will shoot up into the everyday eyes because they're running for president or whatever, and then they disappear. They're not God. We said, why is he coming back into light? You still have to search pretty far to find stuff about climate trace. Like we're talking about it because we talk about these type of things on the podcast.
That's what we do, son.
We break these things down, and
so you don't have to. You can live a normal life, and we nerds can do this bullshit for you. You're welcome. You're fucking welcome.
We enjoy it. We enjoy it.
We love this shit.
It might sound like we're a little frustrated by it, but we enjoy this.
No resentment.
We do enjoy this.
Sure,
my point being is that we don't hear about it, and then out of the blue, 2001, suddenly Al Gore is back with this. So there's a behind the scenes in the meeting rooms, obtaining funding for a program, like setting up a program like this with all the different companies and universities that are involved in this. This is no small thing. This has been worked on probably. I don't know when this came into conception, but I imagine for at least the last 6 years, I imagine there must have been people working behind it. And now we're just hearing about it. Right after the last 2 years we've had and where everything is at. It's just it's something that we definitely will have to keep an eye on and see how it progresses. But
it's very, very concerning when, as you said in their main report, they have basically 5 years of data that they've tracked from 2015 to 2020, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And yet they highlight, as you said, the year and the difference between 2020 and 2021 with the lockdown and then post, and then they have the percentage bars per month of how much it's gone up relative to when we had the lockdown. And it's just, like they really focused in on that to show the difference. Oh, look, and just throwing that out there. No, just conveniently pointing out that there was a huge difference between these 2 years when we had lockdown and no lockdown and emissions, and we're all focused on how we're going to control emissions, but there's no connection. And it's just, it's, again, I go back to these tools put into the hands of policymakers for the sake of control, for the sake of this whole social credit tracking. And as we know, it always gets passed down to the consumer, where it's a carbon tax, whether it's something like this. Man, we're definitely going to have to revisit this subject. And I think that it's of utmost importance. And if you're listening to this, if you resonate with this subject, please share it with somebody else that you think that might benefit from hearing this conversation and becoming more aware of what's going on with these subjects, because I truly believe awareness is the first step, of course. And we need more and more people talking about these subjects, having these conversations, because the impacts, as we've seen through the last couple of years with lockdowns and the control and the fear, and how the language, all the terminology, it's a concerted effort, how even Al Gore himself is using the talks of climate crisis and this and that. It's there's some things coming down the pipeline.
Definitely. And like we've said, it is a technology, and technology is a tool. There's nothing inherently good or evil about it, in our opinion. It's how it's used, and how it's used is dictated by policy, and these policies are written by men and women who have a certain idea of the state of affairs. And so that is what we need to bring focus to. So by sharing this with people, you are at least informing them on this technology. You are presenting to them the aspects that need to be considered and criticized, and perhaps you have some questions yourself now to ask should somebody bring this up. And that's what we're trying to do here.
That's it.
So if you like this, maybe you'll like another one of our episodes. Check us out on any podcast app, go to our website, www.firstprinciplespodcast.com, or check us out on social media. We're on Instagram at First Principles Pod, and the I in first is a 1. So it's First One Principles Pod.
That's it. And last thing is break down from the ground up, guys. That's what we do. That's why we're here. And keep on pushing. That's it.
Peace, everyone.
Peace out.